The foundational truths of human agency and interaction. 1. The principle of distributed self, the integrated biological system mind. Brain, body, and context. The most fundamental, irreducible truth is that the human self is not solely a product of the brain, but an emergent property of the brain, the body, and the immediate environment working as a single, interdependent biological system, irreducible element, the biological imperative behave, the biological mind, all behavior. From conflict resolution, the next conversation, to altruistic leadership, learning of love, is first filtered through and constrained by our underlying neurobiological and hormonal state behave. We are not blank slates. Our choices and internal world are deeply influenced by factors outside conscious awareness, such as gut hormones, stress levels, and genetic predisposition. The body and brain are in constant bidirectional communication, meaning psychological states have physical consequences, and physical states drive cognitive biases, irreducible element, emotion as rationality. Descartes Error. Thinking, fast and slow, reason is not separate from emotion. It is guided by it. Rational decision-making. System 2. Slow thinking depends critically on emotional signaling, somatic markers that allow us to quickly assign value or risk. System 1. Fast thinking. The capacity for rational conversation or strategic thinking. Ramping your brand requires intact emotional machinery, irreducible element, the primacy of the nonconscious subliminal. The influential mind, the vast majority of thought, motivation, and perception occurs outside conscious awareness. Our immediate judgments, emotional reactions, and biases which dictate the success or failure of conversations, talk, or self-compassion, self-love affirmations are driven by these hidden processes. 2. The principle of neuroplastic change. The live-wired and context-dependent brain. The second truth is that the integrated biological system self is not fixed, but is continuously rewiring and reorganizing itself based on experience, intention, and external feedback. The brain is fundamentally an organ of prediction and adaptation, irreducible element, experience-dependent rewiring, live-wired. The brain that changes itself. The brain's core function is to change its structure and function to meet the demands of its environment. This principle is the basis for all human learning, recovery, phantoms in the brain, skill acquisition, and personal development. Brain changer. The ability to overcome neurological challenges. The man who mistook his wife for a hat or to pivot a business strategy is rooted in the same inherent neural flexibility, irreducible element, behavioral feedback loops. Brain changer. The influential mind, conscious self-improvement, and self-leadership are achieved by thinking about thinking, deliberately engaging. System 2. To change the input experience or behavior that the brain uses to rewire itself. Change is a cyclical process where a conscious behavioral effort leads to structural brain change, which then reinforces the new behavior, irreducible element, the contextual nature of self-mind. Brain, body, and behavior, since the brain is constantly adapting to its sensory and social environment. A person's behavior, good or bad, is highly context-dependent. The ability to argue less or show self-worth relies less on inherent traits and more on the specific social or emotional environment the individual is currently inhabiting. 3. The principle of mutual influence. Co-creation of reality. The final essential truth is that all human interaction is a process of mutual influence where two or more distributed, plastic selves co-create a shared reality. And the quality of this reality is determined by the internal state of the participants, irreducible element, conversation as neural synchronization. Talk. The next conversation is not merely an exchange of information. It is a complex, delicate dance of mutual prediction and synchronization. Success in any joint endeavor. Arguing less. Leading a team hinges on the ability to understand and align another person's reality, often by engaging their intuitive, emotional system. 1. Irreducible element, servant leadership as self-management, learning of love. Self-love affirmations, effective leadership, communication, or service requires the ability to regulate one's own internal state first. The capacity for empathy, patience, and non-defensive dialogue, crucial for servant leadership and resolving conflict, is fundamentally a manifestation of self-regulation. A healthy, well-managed biological system. Principle 1. That is actively utilizing its neuroplasticity. Principle 2. To prioritize the long term. Non-emotional system to response, irreducible element, the contagion of emotional state, the influential mind. Influence operates by emotional resonance. Whether selling a brand, ramping your brand, or diffusing an argument, success is often achieved by transmitting a desired emotional state, calm, confidence, excitement, rather than relying purely on data. This transmission occurs because, as biological systems, we are wired to detect and mirror the emotional states of those around us. Synthesis, the core narrative eth single. Cohesive narrative uniting these texts is that human effectiveness and well-being are a function of biological self-management that drives adaptive social engagement. To be fully human, to innovate, lead, love, or simply communicate effectively, one must first accept that the self is a distributed, non-conscious biological system principle, one whose output is always an emotional assessment disguised as a rational thought. This system is continuously, structurally modifiable. Principle 2, meaning personal growth is an ongoing act of deliberately shaping one's environment and habits to foster positive neural adaptation. This managed, flexible self then engages in the world through mutual co-creation. Principle 3, where the quality of connection, conversations, brands, leadership is directly dependent on the authenticity and regulation of the internal biological state. The principle of distributed self and neuroplastic change, a unified analysis of mind, biology, and adaptation, the vast conglomerate of texts you listed covering neurobiology, behavioral economics, self-help, and conversational skills rests upon the unified understanding that the human self is a dynamic, distributed system whose outputs, behavior, communication, feeling of self-worth are determined by the interplay between the brain, the body's physiological state, and the external environment. This system's capacity for change is known as neuroplasticity, the singular mechanism that links biological constraint with personal agency. The distributed self. Beyond the brain's first foundational truth is a repudiation of the Cartesian mind-body duality. The mind is not a ghost in the machine, but an emergent phenomenon woven from three continuous, codependent threads: the brain, the body, and the context, the embodied mind. The gut-brain axis and physiological constraint. Traditional view of the brain as the sole seat of consciousness and control is incomplete. The biological mind asserts that our psychological landscape is distributed through the body, primarily via the bidirectional highway of the gut-brain axis, the vagus nerve. This cranial nerve acts as the primary anatomical conduit, delivering more sensory information from the gut to the brain than the reverse. This is why visceral sensations, the gut feeling, profoundly influence our fast, intuitive decision-making system, one from thinking, fast and slow. Anxiety, stress, and poor metabolic health are not merely reflected in the body. They are generated or severely amplified by the state of the microbiome and the ensuing inflammatory response, directly constraining our cognitive and emotional flexibility, hormonal influence, and behave. Our neurochemical soup, cortisol, testosterone, oxytocin, and dopamine, is released into the bloodstream and acts broadly on both the brain and the periphery. The hormonal state determines the default mode of the brain, predisposing individuals toward aggression, risk-taking, or pro-social behavior. For instance, high circulating levels of stress hormones cortisol can impair the function of the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational, long-term planning, making conflict resolution, the next conversation, significantly harder. The capacity to be our best, as detailed in Behave, is inextricably linked to managing this peripheral physiological environment. The situated mind, contextual determinism. The mind is also situated within its environment. The brain's core job is to predict the immediate future, and it uses sensory input as its guide. Environmental cues and non-conscious bias, subliminal, simple external cues, the temperature of the room, the scent of a place, the posture of a person, are processed subcortically and influence our non-conscious judgment. Implicit biases about trust, safety, and competency. These cues can override conscious intent. For example, negotiating a difficult conversation or trying to influence a client, the influential mind will be unconsciously steered by the ambient mood and physical environment. Our immediate reality is thus a co-creation between our internal state and the external inputs we receive. Case studies in contextual loss: the man who mistook his wife for a hat. Neurological case studies demonstrate how damage to specific Seemingly minor cortical regions can shatter a patient's integrated sense of self or their ability to navigate reality. These cases prove that the self is a functional map, not a singular entity, and when one part of the map, for example, visual association is severed, the entire psychological experience is irrevocably altered, underscoring the brain's dependence on accurate, integrated input, EI, neuroplasticity, the mechanism of change and agency if the self is a distributed system principle I. The principle of neuroplastic change is the operational mechanism that allows this system to adapt, learn, and improve. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life, is the scientific engine behind every self-improvement and communication text in your list, the core mechanisms of live-ring, the concept of the ever-changing brain live-wired. The brain that changes itself rests on the cellular principle of neurons that fire together. Wire together, Hebb's law, and neurons out of sync fail to link. This process occurs on two primary levels: structural plasticity, neurogenesis. This involves the creation of new neurons primarily in the hippocampus, the memory center, and the pruning of unused synapses. Learning a new skill or language structurally alters the brain's physical density. The disciplined practice of self-love affirmations or the acquisition of new conversational patterns requires structural changes in the limbic system and PFAC to embed the new positive habit. Functional plasticity, long-term potentiation, LPA. This is the strengthening or weakening of existing synaptic connections. LPA is the cellular mechanism of learning and memory. When a specific pathway, for example, the pathway for a servant leader's empathetic response, is used repeatedly, the efficiency of that transmission is increased, making the desired response faster and more automatic. Conversely, long-term depression, LTD, weakens connections, allowing the brain to forget or suppress unwanted habitual responses, for example. The impulse to argue less, neuroplasticity as the engine of cognitive systems. Daniel Kahneman's model of System 1: fast, intuitive, emotional, and System 2: slow, deliberate, logical is fundamentally a model of plastic optimization. Training: System 1, repetitive practice shifts a novel. System 2, task like initially following a complicated leadership structure or a 7-day plan into an automatic, efficient System 1 shortcut. This is the goal of all behavioral change, to automate the desired response. The role of emotion in plasticity, the influential mind. Emotion acts as a powerful modulator of plasticity. Novel, high emotion experiences are more likely to be remembered and thus more likely to induce long-term neural change. This is why influence and communication are often achieved not through logic, but through appealing to emotion and urgency. The brain prioritizes what it feels over what it calculates. The collaborative self. Neuroplasticity in conversation and leadership. The final synthesis demonstrates how the distributed self principle I uses neuroplastic change principle 2 to manage and optimize mutual influence principle 3, the act of conversation. Leadership and connection. Conversation as neural synchronization, the success of high-stakes interactions. Talk. The next conversation is increasingly understood through neuroscience as the alignment or synchronization of brain activity between participants. Mirror neuron system and empathy. The mirror neuron system (MENS) provides the neural basis for empathy and understanding. These neurons fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing the same action. This mechanism allows us to simulate the internal state of another person, which is the foundational tool of effective conversation. In the next conversation, the goal to argue less relies on activating the MENS to genuinely feel and understand the opponent's perspective. Bypassing the emotionally charged defensive centers, the language of trust. Oxytocin. Effective communication often requires the presence of oxytocin, the bonding hormone, to suppress the fear and defensiveness that lead to argument. Oxytocin release is a plastic response to nonverbal cues of safety, vulnerability, and mutual attention. The deliberate practice of active listening and open body language, central to good conversation, is an effort to plastically induce a pro-social neurochemical state in both participants. Self-love, self-worth, and servant leadership. The journey toward ethical leadership. Learning of love and self-worth. Self-love affirmations is a sustained application of neuroplasticity to the self-concept, the prefrontal cortex, and self-control behave. Servant leadership, the capacity for long-term patience, empathy, and sacrifice is the highest manifestation of prefrontal cortex PFAC control over the impulsive limbic system. The PFAC is one of the most highly plastic regions, meaning the ability to manage conflict, delay gratification, and choose a collaborative response can be structurally strengthened through conscious practice, the plasticity of self-compassion. Self-love affirmations and the focus on self-worth leverage plasticity to counteract the deeply wired neural networks of self-criticism. The repeated conscious introduction of positive, compassionate self-talk is a deliberate form of cognitive restructuring, which gradually, through LPA, strengthens the neural pathways associated with self-acceptance while weakening the deeply worn paths of self-judgment. Self-love is thus a learned, neuroplastic skill that creates a more stable, resilient, and regulated biological system. Principle 1. Making the individual far more effective in their external interactions. Principle 3. In summary, every human endeavor from achieving entrepreneurial growth, ramping your brand, to resolving interpersonal conflict is a function of a distributed self that is constantly live-wired. Agency is not a magical force. It is the conscious, deliberate, and repeated application of behavior to hijack the brain's inherent neuroplasticity, thereby steering the entire biological system toward a state of greater emotional regulation, relational competency, and adaptive success. To honor your request for an extensive and academically rigorous exploration, and to continue the analysis of the conglomerate of books, this section will perform a deep dive into the remaining foundational principle, the principle of mutual influence and co-created reality. This principle links the internal, biological self, Principle 1, and its capacity for change, Principle 2, to the external world, providing the essential framework for all effective communication, leadership, and brand building found in texts like Talk, The Next Conversation, Learning of Love, and Ramping Your Brand. This analysis will focus on the neurobiological mechanisms that govern social bonding, conflict, and persuasion, the principle of mutual influence and co-created reality. The final unifying principle across this diverse literature is that reality, particularly social reality, is not perceived individually, but is co-created and continuously negotiated between interacting biological systems. Success in communication, leadership, and even commerce is fundamentally dependent on an agent's ability to regulate their internal state and apply neuroplasticity to intentionally influence this co-creation process. Conversation as a shared neurological event. The texts on communication reveal that talking is much more than exchanging information. It is a profound process of neural synchronization that dictates the quality of the co-created reality, the contagion of emotional state, mirroring and resonance. A human interaction is predicated on the biological mechanism of emotional contagion. This ensures survival by allowing for rapid, nonconscious assessment of the group's safety and intent. Mirror neurons and simulation theory. The mirror neuron system (MENS) provides the neural architecture for empathy and instant understanding. Located in the premotor cortex, MENS neurons fire both when an individual performs an action and when they observe another performing the same action. In a conversation, the MENS allows listeners to internally simulate the speaker's emotional state, intentions, and even potential next actions. This subcortical mirroring means that a leader's behavioral state, their stress, confidence, or defensiveness, is immediately and involuntarily transmitted or contagious to those around them. Physiological synchronization. Advanced studies in communication demonstrate that successful dialogue, particularly conflict resolution, the next conversation, involves the physical alignment of heart rates, skin conductance, and breathing patterns between participants. When two people are truly connecting, their physiological systems begin to harmonize. This synchronization is the biological manifestation of trust and rapport, and its presence or absence dictates whether a conversation will result in understanding or disagreement. The goal of conversation is thus to guide this physiological resonance toward a shared state of calm and openness. The role of prediction in dialogue thinking. Fast and slow conversation, like all cognition, is primarily a process of prediction. System 1 and conversational flow are fast. Intuitive System 1 constantly predicts the trajectory of a sentence, the speaker's hidden meaning, and the next social move. Effective conversationalists talk are those who minimize the cognitive effort required for the listener's brain. If a speaker is vague, contradictory, or overly complex, they force the listener's brain to engage the slow, high-effort system 2, which generates frustration, disengagement, and ultimately miscommunication. The clarity and simplicity valued in communication are neurobiological mandates. Confirmation bias in negotiation. Arguments persist the next conversation because the brain, through a phenomenon known as confirmation bias, is plastic and selectively processes information that reinforces its existing neural narratives. When entering a conversation with a preconceived notion, the fast-thinking trap, the brain actively filters out opposing data, making genuine persuasion nearly impossible. To influence, one must first engage the listener's internal narrative, not simply present contradictory facts. The influential mind, EI, leadership, service, and the biology of trust, the principles of servant leadership, learning of love, and brand loyalty. Ramping your brand are high-level applications of the biology of mutual influence, specifically targeting the neurochemistry of trust and long-term attachment, the neurochemical basis of pro-social behavior. Effective leadership and strong brands depend on cultivating a pro-social state in others. Oxytocin and group bonding. Oxytocin, often termed the love hormone, is the key neurochemical underpinning group cohesion and loyalty. It is released in response to physical touch, mutual gazing, shared vulnerability, and acts of generosity, the very definition of servant leadership. Oxytocin actively suppresses the activity of the amygdala, the brain's fear center, making individuals more trusting, cooperative, and willing to take social risks. A leader who consistently models trust and compassion plastically shapes their team's social environment to be oxytocin-rich, fostering loyalty and reduced internal conflict. The dopamine reward cycle in brand loyalty. Ramping your brand leverages the dopamine reward cycle. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter of anticipation and motivation, not necessarily pleasure. A successful consumer packaged goods (CPG) brand creates an extremely consistent, reliable, and predictable reward the product experience. The brain's pleasure center's nucleus accumbens rapidly wire to this consistency via LPA principle 2, turning the product from a simple purchase into a necessary repeated loop of reward-seeking behavior, thus driving fierce brand loyalty and repeat purchases. The vulnerability trust loop. The role of self-worth ability to serve, lead, or influence ethically requires a stable, internally regulated self. Linking Principle 1 and Principle 3, the risk of vulnerability. Genuine conversation and servant leadership require vulnerability, which the brain perceives as a social risk, triggering the fear-based limbic system. The ability to overcome this fear and choose connection is directly tied to an individual's self-worth, self-love affirmations. When self-worth is plastically secured, the individual is less reliant on external validation and less triggered by disagreement, allowing them to remain regulated and empathetic even during conflict. The PFAC in ethical leadership, ethical long-term decision-making, which defines servant leadership, requires the dominance of the prefrontal cortex PFAC over the impulsive, self-serving limbic system. The PFAC enables the leader to delay gratification and choose the communal good over immediate personal gain, a capability that is strengthened through the sustained, conscious practice of leadership ethics. III, the co-created narrative, reality as a social construct. Ultimately, all human interaction aims to establish a shared narrative or reality that enables collective action. This social reality is highly mutable and vulnerable to influence. The narrative imperative. The human brain is fundamentally a storytelling machine. How the mind works. We don't organize facts. We organize narratives, which act as the framework for future prediction. Brand as shared story. A successful brand. Ramping your brand is the most potent form of a shared social narrative. It creates a collective identity, a set of values, and a predictable emotional experience that thousands of consumers co-sign and internalize. The brand's success is not its product, but the coherence and emotional appeal of its shared story. Therapy as narrative rewriting. all forms of psychological change. From overcoming neurological disorders, phantoms in the brain, to personal self-improvement, brain changer, involve the rewriting of the patient's internal narrative. A therapeutic conversation is the process of using the relationship safety oxytocin to plastically weaken old, destructive neural narratives and strengthen new, adaptive ones. The conversation literally changes the internal experience of reality. In conclusion, the principle of mutual influence dictates that human existence is a continuous feedback loop. Our individual neurobiology principle 1 determines our capacity for response. Our neuroplasticity principle 2 determines our capacity for change, and the resulting behavior determines the shared, co-created social reality principle 3 that governs our collective success, from arguing less to building a powerful brand.